Okay.
Thank you, Julianne.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Jonas.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Very happy to be here. This is the cover of my book, Outer Beauty, Inner Joy, Contemplating the Soul of the Renaissance, with a foreword. I'm very fortunate to have a foreword by Thomas More. And I recently did an interview with him, a podcast, and that's on my website. And he's talking about embracing the soul of the Renaissance. It was from him that I started to read about Marsilio Ficino, because he writes about Marsilio Ficino and the Renaissance a lot in his books. So we know that the Renaissance was an explosion of art and beauty in the Western world, but not everyone is familiar with the philosophy that inspired it. I didn't know anything about it until I, on my continued trips to Italy, became exposed to the philosophy along with the art. During the Renaissance, scholars were studying many different philosophic and religious traditions, seeking a common thread and combining them in their own philosophies. And at the same time, artists were also using many levels of symbolism in their works. And since these scholars were patrons of the arts, they were indicating to the artists what they should put in their paintings. This is the allegory on water, Birth of Venus, by Giorgio Vasari, who wrote the lives of the artists. The more famous Birth of Venus, of course, is by Botticelli. But there were many images of the Birth of Venus during the Renaissance. It was an ancient symbol from antiquity. This painting is in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, which was one of the principal homes of the Medici family. It was done in 1555, which was about 100 years after Hermeticism and Neo-Platonism arrived in Florence, and Marsilio Ficino had his Platonic Academy. It has many levels of symbolism. It's a history painting. It was done for a descendant of Cosimo de' Medici the Elder, who started the Platonic Academy. It was done for Cosimo I. It has a lot of astrological symbolism according to his natal chart.
Excuse me, by Cosimo the First, you mean the first Archduke, huh?
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
exactly. It has so much symbolism that Vasari actually wrote a book explaining the symbolism. So we're not going to talk too much about all of the symbolism in this painting, but it shows the various strands of philosophy that intermingled during the Renaissance: humanism, Neoplatonism, and Hermeticism. The water element is the source of all life, purification, and regeneration, and at the center is the birth of Venus, goddess of peace, love, and beauty. The Renaissance really was the rebirth of this ancient goddess with all that she symbolized. It was the rebirth of art and beauty. So the book that I've done is a selection of quotes from some of the great writers of the Italian Renaissance, combined with photographic images that express the Renaissance ideal of beauty, and they're imaginatively placed together to create a feeling, certainly the feeling I get when I'm walking around Italy looking at these things and thinking about the writing that inspired them. Artists were thought to be able to contact unseen forces and bring their essence into their creations. Through contemplations of these images, viewers could also touch this divine essence. Renaissance philosophers were, while for the most part maintaining their Christian roots, placed a new value on life on earth. Experiences with nature, art, and love were ways to experience the divine here and now, as Kathleen was talking about. Today I'm going to talk in a little while primarily about Marsilio Ficino, who was probably the most important philosopher of the Italian Renaissance and of the Renaissance, and about one of his works in particular, which was called Commentary on Plato's Symposium on Love, or else it was just called On Love. It influenced the subject matter of paintings by some Italian Renaissance artists who were painting on the subject of love and beauty. But first I just will talk a little bit about Italy as the birthplace of the Renaissance and the rise of humanism in Italy. This is a picture by Giotto, who was at the very end of the medieval period and the beginning of the Renaissance. It is from a series of frescoes called Scenes from the Life of St. Francis. This is the death and ascension of St. Francis. It's in the Bardi Chapel in the Church of Santa Croce in Florence. During the medieval period, there were two focal points, feudalism and the church, one for the earthly realm and one for the supernatural realm, and they were very rigid systems. And with the very slow development of the Renaissance, we saw the rebirth of individual in society, more freedom of thought, able to determine for ourselves, how people felt. And it was also the time of the rise of powerful independent city-states. So before the beginning of the Renaissance and of humanism proper, in the 14th century with Petrarch, in the 13th century, St. Francis introduced the idea of the enjoyment of art and nature, of the enjoyment that the splendor of God was in all creation. And artists began to paint pictures of saints in a more naturalistic human way. Humanism emerged over then a long period of time as a fusion of Christian and classical thought. And we know that it's a period that remains fundamental to modern Western culture. It was the beginning of the modern age, renewed interest in history, literature, and the arts. The sense of self, the individual, was defined at that time, looking back to the Greek concept of man as the measure of all things. It was the beginning of our educational system, modern math, experimental science, art as we know it today, perspective and light, three-dimensional reality, focus on the human figure and depicting nature, and showing secular works from Greek and Roman mythology. Theater developed, music with the polyphonic music, architecture, literature, philosophy, and with the advent of movable type in the printing press, there was a wide diffusion of books and ideas and thoughts. So why Italy? Why did this happen there? It was geographically in a prime position with a lot of seaports. It's a peninsula, so it's open to the sea on three sides. It was a point of contact between the East and West, between Europe and the Byzantine Empire. The Crusades, which began just before 1100, brought a lot of people through Italy, and northern knights embarked from Italian ports on their crusades. A large mercantile culture developed. There were links with Eastern merchants and cities. There was a growth of cities and towns. And with this growth of the mercantile culture and the cities and towns, there developed a need for secular education for the first time. Before education had been in the church, people associated with the church were educated. Other people didn't have too much education. So this was really the beginning of secular education. There was a need for trained notaries and lawyers to write contracts, people to write letters. So this all contributed to the development of education. With the expansion of urban life, there was a creation of a class of educated, wealthy laymen. And for the first time, it was possible to attain a position in society not determined by birth, but created by wealth and intelligence. Italy grew wealthy. So Italy was made up of independent city-states, but they all did have some things in common. They had sort of a common language. There were many dialects, but it was still Italian. And they all they were all members of the Roman Catholic Church, and they all saw themselves as part of the heritage of the Roman Empire, and this gave them energy. It was an energizing myth. All around they saw the survival of ancient buildings. So by the later 14th century, there was a sense of common culture among Italians. As we said before, the Renaissance ushered in a sense of personal individual freedom. And there was a recognition that the content and style of ancient literature could improve the human condition on life on earth. Dante was a turning point. He was the end of the medieval period, the beginning of the Renaissance. He wrote in the vernacular, which was a new thing. He created individual characters seeking self-knowledge in a complex world. And with Petrarch, really, this was the beginning of humanism. Petrarch lived from 1304 to 1384. And this is when we can say the Renaissance mentality began. He was the one who was the first to sponsor the recovery of ancient texts that had been hidden away in monasteries and libraries over the Middle Ages. And he felt that pagan literature could have an instructive and uplifting message, that clear, persuasive language could be a virtue in itself. And we know he invented the sonnet sequence, took ancient literature as his guide and inspiration, and he was really the impetus for other people to then go and look at these ancient texts, bring them out. Humanism then led to civic humanism. What was civic humanism? The responsibility of the individual for the state of one's life and a connection between the individual and the community and cities and building these beautiful cities. There were excavations in Rome going on now, and many artists flocked to Rome to study the ancient architecture, bring it back. They found beautiful sculptures and bronzes and started working in that way. Here we have a picture of Florence, and that's Brunelleschi's dome. Brunelleschi was one of the first to go to Rome and study the ancient architecture. It's a miracle of design and engineering, and it's still the tallest building in Florence. Florence was the cradle of humanism in the Renaissance. It was one of the wealthiest areas in Italy, a major trade route, active commerce center. It had a highly developed woolen cloth industry. And when the feudal system came to an end, and the Republic was founded on guild membership and shared responsibility, people had more freedom and independence. They focused on building wealth and patronizing the arts as a part of civic humanism. They treated their city as a work of art, and they felt that the city was a visible representation of the community. So into this cultivated, cultured city arrived in the 15th century Platonism and Hermeticism. Here's Marsilio Ficino, who was the first to translate all of Plato's works into Latin, and the Corpus Hermeticum, a group of 14 texts brought into Italy. His patron was Cosimo de' Medici the Elder, who was an ardent humanist with a great interest in ancient texts and mystical knowledge. I'm going to give just a brief background on Neoplatonism. I hope I'm correct, because I have an expert here in the audience. Neoplatonism can said to have begun, actually immediately after Plato. People were interpreting his works in many ways. But the so-called founder or father of Neoplatonism was Plotinus during the 3rd century. Neoplatonism had its origins in Hellenistic syncretism, which was also responsible for Gnosticism and the Hermetic tradition. Another major influence on Neoplatonism was the introduction of Jewish scriptures into Greek intellectual circles. Plotinus created a synthesis of Christian and Gnostic ideas with the traditional Platonic philosophy. He said that all objective existence is only the external expression of a contemplative deity known as the One or the Good, and that this diminution of the divine essence, or this the one into the many, is a necessary moment of the complete expression of the unfolding of the one. It's not something bad, we haven't degenerated, it's part of the cosmic process. And the elevated experience of the individual soul to the status of an actualization of a divine form, and he preserved the dignity of personality, and this comes back in the Renaissance with Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, who wrote Oration on the Dignity of Man. Plotinus felt that the individual soul could achieve salvation through philosophical investigation.